I was in film school during the 70s, and that was the height of the bad boy outsider. But there weren't female equivalents to those characters. You know, the women were still pretty much their girlfriends, or they were bad girls and they died or ended up in European cinema, the women were able to be a little more complicated. And so those kinds of characters, rebel girls, were sort of an inspiration for when I made Smithereens and then, would go on to make Desperately Seeking Susan.
Susan Seidelman, it's such an honor to have you here. Smithereens is one of my absolute favorite New York stories as a time capsule of like a wonderful period of New York history pre-Giuliani, but also I think it just resonates so much with our current moment of people running around the city chasing fame. And it's such a great film to rediscover now in 2025. Thank you so much for making it. And thank you for writing this incredible, delightful memoir, which is out now. Everyone should go pick it up. You grew up in suburban Philadelphia, is that right? The suburban Philadelphia area. How
Yeah.
did you go from there to New York to become a filmmaker?
I never planned to be a film director. I liked movies as a kid, but the only movies I had seen really were the ones at the local shopping mall cinema. So I didn't have a knowledge of foreign films or independent films. And actually, back then, there weren't too many independent films. I went to college originally thinking I wanted to be a fashion designer because I was an artsy kid, and that was a way a lot of women at that time could kind of get their entree into the world of art on a whim, totally on a whim. I took a film appreciation 101 class, and that's when I got hooked. I suddenly, this one class and a great teacher got me thinking about movies in a different way, got me realizing that I could apply the visual designs that I was interested in, whether it was fashion or graphic design or all those things. I could put them into films. I could tell stories and add music. I applied to a bunch of film schools, got rejected by a bunch, but miraculously got accepted to NYU. And so it took me to the city I wanted to be in, living in. And as soon as I started making movies, actually physically making movies, I realized this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
To end up at NYU at that time, I want to know what that was like because I'm very familiar with NYU. I teach classes there. It's a very different place, I imagine, than how it was then.
Yeah.
Specifically, the gender ratios must have been quite stark. I mean, it was a very male-dominated
Yeah.
industry until very, very recently. Were you one of the only female students in the film program at the time?
Well, there were 35 students in the class. There were 5 women and 30 men. And, NYU back then, we're talking 1974, 75, 76. It was pretty funky. The building was in the East Village. It was on East 7th Street and 2nd Avenue.
Mhm.
And we shared space with the Fillmore East, which was a rock club at that time. So it was in the heart of the East Village, which was kind of fascinating because the East Village was going through a lot of changes at that time. But it also was pretty disconnected from Hollywood. I mean, the chairman of the film department had never been to Hollywood. All the students sort of were looking towards the French New Wave as their role models. All the guys wanted to be Jean-Luc Godard.
Right.
And but and it was again, we're talking pre-internet. So we didn't have the kinds of information that film students have today. I didn't know about film festivals or agents or what Hollywood was looking for, you know, and with that kind of naivete came a certain sort of freedom.
You made a couple shorts. And
Mhm.
then when it came time to make Smithereens, you've mentioned you watched Nights of Cabiria, and you were specifically influenced by Julieta Messina's characters, wardrobe and style and character traits from that movie to create Ren. What other influences, both filmic and personal experiences, did you bring to that creation?
Yeah, well, again, I got to watch a lot of French New Wave films, but I also got to watch a lot of Italian post-war films. And what I loved about the post-war films was that they used the ruins from after World War II, the crumbling neighborhoods, the scrappy life that in particular Kabiria in that movie was living, but they used it in a way that was integrated into the story. And New York City at that time was in the middle of a bankruptcy crisis, so it really was falling apart. You know, buildings were dilapidated, especially in the East Village. It was a decade before gentrification.
Mhm.
And, the garbage wasn't being collected. And there was a real texture to the East Village that I saw also in those Italian neo-realistic films.
Mhm.
And so I thought, why not use that grittiness, that the fact that I didn't have any money to build sets and everything, use that and turn it into the art direction. Instead of letting it be a limitation, let it be a strength.
I love it. You've talked about loving details in other interviews, and I love details. And revisiting this movie, I always pick up on new, exciting, interesting details, and I want to ask you about a few of them.
Okay.
One is the presence of television. Last time I watched this film, I noticed there was just televisions cropping up in different shots. She's carrying
Yeah.
around this broken television. What was that intentional, or was that just a feature of everyday life then?
No, it was kind of intentional. Again, not knowing that, what the culture would be 30 years later or 40 years later now. I didn't know how, not TV, but images, whether it's internet or, all the stuff we see streaming, social media, all that. And selfies. I mean, in the case of Smithereens, Ren is taking Polaroids of herself, Xeroxing them, and then placing them around the city, posting them on subway walls.
Hmm. And I noticed that I don't, you must have made this, you must have filmed it before Reagan came into office, but don't you have, is it bedtime for Bonzo or something on the screen? Oh, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
How'd you?
Yeah, yeah. Again, there was, in those days, I mean, somehow I got a clip and I used it.
Amazing.
But
Yeah.
also, this was the beginning of cable television and early cable television. In fact, it was in New York, it was Manhattan cable. So you had all these crazy, like religious, talk shows or, just all this very funky imagery. And so I thought, again, it would be interesting to incorporate that just in the background, not make a big deal about it, but just for those people who might watch the film a second or a third time, there would be another layer that they could look at.
Yeah. I love it. It's texturally, it's just like so evocative and interesting. And I love the way that you use that song. There's that moment where Ren's leaves with her friend and she leaves the record playing, and then you cut to the next scene and the song is playing continuously but diegetically in the next scene. That's
Yeah.
such a beautiful transition that I totally missed the first few times I saw, and just one of those things that you notice. I mean, this film,
Yeah.
unlike other films from the period, which I like looking at, I just feel like it's so much more cleverly composed and created. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
I think again, some of it is from my background of originally wanting to be a fashion designer and being aware that all those details matter and tell stories.
How did you find Susan Berman to play this role, which is incredible? She's incredible. And she's, from what I understand, she's nothing like this character, which is so hard to believe. I mean, you'd think you'd have to cast someone exactly like this, but
Yeah, yeah.
um,
Well, she had a spunkiness that was like that character. She had a kind of feisty, she was thin and wiry and kind of a little, and energetic. So that was part of who she was. That became part of the character. But, originally, being an NYU film student at that time, for our student films, we would always cast, we would put ads into Backstage newspaper, and aspiring actors would read that and then send headshots or whatever. So originally I went about casting a more traditional route. But I realized that a lot of the actresses I was meeting seemed to be playing the character, but it felt like acting, not being. Literally, a friend of mine from film school happened to go to an off Broadway performance piece. It wasn't even a play, it was just a wacky experimental performance in some
Hmm.
loft in Soho before Soho was Soho, right?
Yeah.
And saw this girl in this performance that he thought was really interesting, and told me about her and gave me, he had gotten her phone number. I called her up. We met like a day or two later. And as soon as she walked into the room, I just thought there was something about her that was just absolutely perfect.
And there was a mishap in the first week of filming that changed the trajectory of the film, possibly for the better. I think probably for the better. Do you want to tell us more about that?
Yeah, it was absolutely for the better. What happened was, on our fifth day of shooting, we were shooting in a very old loft. I think it was somewhere in Tribeca. And it was a scene where the character of the character of Eric, who was eventually played by Richard Hell, but at the time was actually slightly different, was played by a European actor. And that character was an artist, a painter, not a musician, because this was also during the time when all these East Village painters were just starting to get some attention. And there was a scene where he throws her out of his loft by putting her out of his window, literally picking her up and placing her outside of his window. And where there was a fire escape, and she ran along the fire escape without looking to try to get into another open window. And I'm inside the loft watching this happen, and I see her run along and then just drop. What happened is there was a hole in the fire escape, and she just ran along, fell through the hole, and the ceilings were about 18, 20 feet high. It was a big drop. Fortunately, she didn't land on the sidewalk. She landed on the fire escape one floor down, but she broke her leg. And I thought that was devastating at the time, because I didn't know how I was going to keep the crew together, and I was running out of money, and but I decided to use that as an advantage. So I knew she was going to be in a cast for 3 months while she healed. And I used that time to rewrite the script, brought in a new writer, a guy named Ron Neiswaner, who turned out to be a very
Amazing.
well-known writer.
Yeah.
I didn't know that at the time. And to rethink the role of the character Eric, because it wasn't really working with him being a painter. I knew he wanted to be a kind of interesting East Village character, but we changed him to a kind of punk rocker. And once we did that, through a friend of a friend of a friend, I met Richard Hell. And when I met him, I thought he was perfect for this role. And that's what happened. So I think, had Susan not broken her leg, the film would not have been as good, because the chemistry between those characters was just okay, not great. And I got a chance to also see what was working and see what wasn't working, and adjust the script accordingly.
Hmm. And not only did you bring in Ron, but at some point, maybe after you'd finished a rough cut or something, Jonathan Demme became involved. Just he gave you some pointers about finding the feelies. Is that right? Like, can you tell me
Oh.
about what influence he had on the life of the movie?
Yeah, Jonathan was just sort of had his first like Hollywood hit or mainstream hit. He had a film that was called Melvin and Howard, that was getting some attention, but he was always very supportive of younger filmmakers. And I, I met him and basically asked if he could come see the film. And he was kind enough to, I just showed it to him in a private screening room, or actually on a Steenbeck, in a screening room. And he said, he made some suggestions about music because he was always into music. And at first, he mentioned a guy named John Cale, who was one of the Velvet Underground. And I met with him, and we were both, he was in a funky place in his life. It didn't work. And then Demme told me about the Feelies, who had just recorded their first album. I think it was called Crazy Rhythm. And I listened to it. And when I listened to it, I realized that the energy of their music totally matched the energy of the character of Ren. And, normally in a film, you edit the whole film and then you score the movie to the edited picture. But I liked the energy of their music so much that I ended up recutting certain scenes to fit their music.
Yeah, it's the music in this film is so great. I love not only those tracks, but some of the other ones. I don't know who the artists are, but there's kind of like a reggae track in the beginning, sort of close to the
Yeah.
beginning of
Yeah.
the film. That's amazing. So much good stuff. Before we move on from the cast, I mean, I love all the principals, but like oh my God, the scene with the prostitute who comes into Paul's
Yeah.
van is one of the best scenes ever. It advances nothing, but it sort of
Yeah.
embodies everything.
Yeah.
Who is that? I hear
Yeah.
that tragically she died before the movie was
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
questions. I'm going to try and land on one. Did
Yeah.
you were filming on the 49th Street-ish and the West Side Highway, all that stuff. There were real characters hanging around.
Yeah.
Was she
Yeah.
amongst them? Was she an actor? Who was she?
She was a aspiring actress. I don't know if she's ever done any other movies, but thank you for mentioning that, because that's my favorite scene in the movie. And as you say, it has nothing to do with the plot really, but it has everything to do with the characters and the world and the environment. And it's one of those scenes that, had this been more of a Hollywood movie, I'm sure a studio executive would have said, cut that out. It doesn't advance the story. And I'm so glad I didn't. But her name was Kathleen Riley, and she was a girl who lived up in near the Bronx. There's a section up there that's very Irish.
Hmm.
I forget what it's called. It's like in the 200s.
Mhm.
She lived up there, aspiring actress. I don't think she'd made a movie before, but when she came in, there was just something about her voice and her rough authenticity. But there was a sweetness there too.
I visited my mother the other day. Boy, was that a trip. She's sweet, but I think she's getting a little senile. How's a sandwich?
It's good.
And you talked about also being inspired by collaborations, obviously Fellini, but Claude Chabrol and Stéphane Audran you mentioned in one interview as a pairing that you drew a lot of inspiration from. I love Chabrol. I love the films that they made together. So
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
excited to hear that that inspired you as well.
Well, what inspired me was all these European actresses that were allowed to play such complicated characters, because I was in film school during the 70s, and that was the height of the bad boy outsider, but there weren't female equivalents to those characters. The women were still pretty much their girlfriends, or they were bad girls and they died or ended up in European cinema. The women were able to be a little more complicated. And so those kinds of characters, rebel girls, were sort of an inspiration for when I made Smithereens, and then, would go on to make Desperately Seeking Susan.
What was it like to work with Madonna? I understand in the beginning she wasn't so famous, and by the end of Principal Photography, the story had changed. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like to navigate?
Yeah, again, I should tell you that, the reason that I cast her was because, having made Smithereens and sort of knowing and being involved a little bit in that downtown music world, I knew who Madonna was. I knew she was this aspiring singer playing in some of the clubs. This was a little later. This was like 82, 83 now. And MTV had just started, and there weren't that many music videos back then. And she had made, I think it was Borderline, that was the first music video of hers that I noticed on MTV. And I thought, even though she wasn't well known in a mainstream way, she had something, she knew how to flirt with the camera. There was something a little like a cheeky bad girl about her that I found interesting. So when we were looking to cast Desperately Seeking Susan, Roseanne Arquette had already been cast in the one lead role, and we were looking for her counterpart. Originally, we went through the more traditional up and coming actresses of that time. Melanie Griffith, Linda Fiorentino, Ellen Barkin. I think Kim Cattrall might have come in to audition. There were a bunch of women who were just starting out. Um, and they were very good, and they might have been great in this movie, but I kind of I had good luck working with a musician who was a non-actor in the form of Richard Hell in
Yeah.
Smithereens. So I thought it might be interesting to do that again. There was something very, using a real New York street girl to play a New York street girl felt organic to me. The problem was that the studio executives at Orion, the studio out in LA, had no idea who she was. So I had to jump through some hoops, as did she. Like, she had to do a screen test and go out to LA to schmooze the executives and all that. But she did, and they liked the screen test, and that's how I got to work with her. But she wasn't that famous. I mean, the proof is I know what she was paid, and I know what Roseanne Arquette was paid, and it wasn't the same, but during the course of, or the 9 weeks that we were filming, suddenly her Like a Virgin album was released towards the end, like maybe week 7 of our shoot. And suddenly it was like madness. She was, on the cover of Rolling Stone. There was a lot of buzz about her. Suddenly, we needed security on set to just kind of keep fans away.
Amazing.
But the good news was that she, we already had a working relationship that was good, and there wasn't any prima donna stuff because that wasn't our relationship. So there were no managers or agents or her own personal trainer and hairstylist. None of those people were hovering around the monitor or telling me how, I should film it this way or that way. So I had the advantage of working with a unknown star or movie star, but the advantage of her fame once the film was released.
Amazing. Again, amazing luck. And one of my favorite things about the memoir is the way you're so candid about the way you struggled to gain trust with Rosanna. And you talk about that moment in the Port Authority shooting there. I wonder if you could tell me what you learned both in that experience and since about gaining trust with actors.
Well, that is so important to have the actors trust you, because the bottom line is if they don't trust you, they worry that they're going to be making a fool of themselves on film. But if they do trust you, they will go to the limit. They will, they won't be afraid of pushing themselves, of pushing their performance to that edge that makes it interesting, because they trust that you will have their best interests in mind in the editing room. And I think it was, it was a little difficult with me and Rosanna because she had been hired to be the star of the movie. And then we hired this, unknown singer, Madonna. And then the dynamic started to shift as we were filming. And I think that has to be hard on anyone to come in as a star and then find yourself in what the press are calling the Madonna movie. And I think because I had hired Madonna and she had been attached to the project before I came on board, it just, put some tension in our relationship. And I think she didn't, none of us knew that the film was going to be successful. And so I think she had just come off filming the Martin Scorsese movie After Hours. And he was this big established director. He was a guy. I mean, keep in mind, there weren't that many women directing women back then. And, directing does have a certain amount of cajoling and schmoozing and maybe even a little flirtatiousness involved in it, in a good way. You want to charm people sometimes if you need them to get the best performance at times. And I think it was, we were still both learning. She was learning how to work with a female director, a new experience, and I was learning how to work with a Hollywood actress, because all the actors I had worked with in the past were New York, kind of funky New York independent actors. There was no star stuff going on. So it was a learning experience, I think, for both of us. And, I remember times thinking towards the end of the shoot that, she was already mentally onto her next movie. I remember seeing her sitting in the corner one day reading the script for her next movie. I'm blanking on the name of it. Silverado. Called Silverado. And she was like all excited that was going to be the next big hit. And, I think we were all surprised when the movie came out that it was, a critical, but also a commercial success, and for her,
Yeah.